today's topic is nonviolent governance, nonviolent leadership, excuse me. And this, for many young people seems like a non sequitur. How can you speak about such leadership when the model of leadership which we see, political leadership mainly, seems to be so violent? The society, I would argue, has left us myopic, and we do not see a non-violent leadership when it exists in community, in social movements, in our schools, in our universities, and even among many political participants. So we have to have an intentional effort to not give in to violence, not to give in to resist violence on a daily basis and cultivate nonviolence. We will be talking about social movement leadership, community leadership, and educational leadership among the 42 speakers that we have today. But let me now come and introduce you to our first panel, which is an amazing panel of people from 3 countries around the world. We have Soetoro-Ng, who's from Hawaii, Honolulu, speaking to us today, the co-founder and advisor of the Institute for Climate and Peace. She is a consultant to the Obama consultant. She serves on there, does a lot of work in Asia with youth and with many other communities. Maya also works on the local level in Honolulu and other parts of the States, working with young people in various peace and climate mitigating actions. She's also an academic at the College of Education at the University of Hawaii. What Maya has done is brought to us such a unique set of skills in looking at this issue of nonviolent leadership. I also want to present our second speaker, Shashi Tharoor. He was the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, one of the most senior posts globally. He's also been a former Minister of State for Human Resources in India. He is a third-time member of Parliament from Trivandrum in Kerala. He of information technology. So I know Shashi will be that we are trying to bring so much information through technology from India. And he is the author of 20 books. Shashi for us is a real leader and brings together a myriad of skills to talk to us today. We also have Dreano. He is from Paris. He is a green activist. He is the president of Spokesperson, which is a civil society, a very important one, and solidarity organization. He is a founding member of the Helsinki Citizen Forum, as you know, which was set up in 1990. He's also the chair of the French branch of the Assembly of European Citizens. He is an international member of the World Social Forum and has done a lot to bring people from all the world movements together. We welcome so much Bernard and what he is as society in Europe, internationally. We also have with us Rajagopal PV, who is a senior Gandhian leader in India. He's worked with the downtrodden for more than 4 decades. He is the founder of one of the largest land movements in the country, Ekta. He is also the leader of the Jai Jagat March and campaign. And so with these 4 introductions. I now want to turn the presentation over to Maya Ji for her intervention. I thank all the viewers for putting up with our technical issues. We have at least 16 backup systems to keep going in spite of all the difficulties of weather here in Kerala, the monsoon rains. So stay with us. We have an amazing lineup of speakers today. And I can assure you that over these next 10 hours, we are going to bring some of the important and significant ideas together to bring forward the Jai Jagat campaign. Thank you very much. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much, Jill. It's such an honor to be here. I'm exceedingly grateful for your leadership and for the participation and courageous work of everyone here. Jai Jagat. I am delighted to kick us off to sort of consider what nonviolent leadership looks like, or what elements of nonviolent leadership are important at this time. These are unusual times, obviously, and COVID's impact is exacerbating conflict in some cases and violence. And there's an obvious need for more cross-sectoral peace building and initiatives that are led from beside, behind, and beneath. As humanity struggles to confront this pandemic, though, we are seeing everywhere communities and countries working cooperatively to contain the virus. We're seeing global health diplomacy in places of water scarcity and vulnerable locations like refugee camps or settlements of displaced people. We are seeing powerful peace building and sharing efforts to improve water, sanitation, hygiene, and infrastructure that is sorely needed to address the pandemic and to lead to less health disparity. So in all of these instances, it's positive peace building, which is so important when faced with uncertainty in particular. It's not simply the absence of conflict, but the active participation of everyone of every age. And we saw that in your film, and the Jai Jagat movement is really appealing to neighbors and community everywhere. We saw that people are awake, and a big question is how we can take that wonderful energy, that courage and generosity and awareness, and retain that altruism and a sense of courage. All along, we realize now that we did know how to take care of one another, and we see that we can ask people to do things that are radically different and seemingly unthinkable, and as long as we have real participatory leadership. So in addition to positive peace building, I want to suggest that we need, and in order to create positive peace building, we need everyone's participation. And remember that public life is not the same as political life, that people who are not political can engage in public life. We have Gandhiji, who was such a charismatic and singular leader. However, what we are seeing now, I think here in the United States with the Black Lives Matter, thinking about Martin Luther King's legacy and his vision of the beloved community, is a community that is rising up in many corners. People who are in the margins and in the shadows are coming into the light and into the center. And what we see is also that, although charismatic leaders are wonderful symbols of inspiration and guidance, that now we can have leaderless movements. We can have leaders who are invisible, but incredibly powerful. All of us and everyone on this call and everyone who will view afterwards can contribute so much by blogging or vlogging or self-publishing, raising their voices and sharing images on social media, but also by virtue of peace education and the powerful inspirational movement building that's happening. A big part of that, of course, I believe, is that we need to see persistence. This pandemic is something that everyone wants to be over and sooner rather than later, but everything requires a measure of time and continued courage. So we need to redefine courage. I used to think of courage as sort of jumping out of a plane and skydiving, which I have done. And now I think of courage much more in terms of walking along the long road as the Jai Jagat March has done, and being hungry, being thirsty, being lonely, metaphorically speaking, not knowing where you're going to get your next meal, not knowing the destination and who will befriend you in a time of need, but continuing to walk anyway. And I believe that that is what we need. And so I want us to, if you don't mind, if all of the participants can take a deep breath, I would like for you to think about your definition of peace. And if possible, make note of it in chat in one word or one sentence. But just, I want this to be a little bit interactive if possible. So just take 1 minute and please make note of your definition. I'm not seeing it in chat, but maybe it's not enabled, but oh, there we go. Love, I see one. When truth prevails. Positive engagement, acceptance. A world that works for all. Harmony, togetherness, persistence, reverence for living things, conscience-based resolution of conflict, equality, quiet. So all of these definitions are, of course, equally interesting and valid. And I want to point out that some of those definitions can be thought of as in contention or conflict with one another. For instance, if your definition of peace is quiet and harmony, you might be in a place of some disagreement with those whose definition is social justice, raising your voice, protest. But there is room for everyone. And I want to point out that Gandhiji himself, although he spoke of the importance of nonviolence, he sometimes said that that word was insufficient because it spoke of what was not rather than what was, what we wanted, what we want to see. And I think that we may not have a better word, but we can begin to utilize and live up to his vision. If you keep your definition of peace in mind and you think about the need to participate in whatever way you can, harness your inner strength, your resources, your networks, your voices, your tools, and ensure that you are making an impact. You are entering the stream, you are entering the march, and you are redefining courage for yourselves, for the collective good, and in order to consider interbeing. I believe that there is much that we can do together in sacred kinship with one another, and with a spiritual core. So it's connected leadership, and it is servant leadership, of course, but it's deeply inclusive and participatory, and we can't really have a model of leadership that does not include youth voices, that does not include women. We have to make sure that it is fully intersectional, and that we think about ecological peace building and environmental peace as being equally important. Climate change and this pandemic know no borders. And so we have to have a true commitment to hearing everyone's story and making sure that everyone can bring in their artistry and make leadership a creative process. That, of course, also means that we have to listen. And it has to be careful listening or double listening, not simply listening in order to respond, but listening with wonder and awe and curiosity and imagination, and leading with a sense of reverence for what we might discover about one another, and resisting racism, division, and exclusion with a sense of deep commitment to and belonging to one another. We are explorers right now, all of us, and this means that we have to imagine the possibilities. We have to really paint and post the future. We have to cast the net widely. We have to layer in all of our personal stories in order to expand and extend the personal to the public. But I feel incredibly hopeful with all of you together on this journey, and all of you committed to teaching others and working with others, and renewing our sense of commitment, so that wherever we emerge after this pandemic, we are stronger than we were before. But thank you very much for giving me these few moments, and I look forward to hearing from everyone who will speak in the next 10 hours. And sending you much aloha from Hawaii.
Thank you very much, and I hope the audibility problems have not transferred themselves to me. You can all make violent gestures if you can't hear me. I just wanted to say that it's a pleasure to be part of this very distinguished panel and to talk about the prospects of nonviolent leadership from a global perspective as much as an Indian one, because it's very much a timely discussion. We're living in an era where our societies are increasingly becoming fractured, where questions of identity and ideology appear to be driving us further away from each other. And I would say at a time when the vacuum created by the absence of a leadership that can once again help us to achieve the collective aims of unity and consensus is being felt across all aspects of our daily lives. To my mind, the state of the world order, where borders are becoming more rigid, communities are marginalized, the notion of us versus them is attaining primary importance in so many countries, are all aspects that I believe clearly demonstrate a certain crisis of leadership that is being experienced across the globe. We are increasingly seeing in many countries a leadership that promotes clashes, clashes of individuals, clashes of interests, clashes of identities, as their means of coming to power and retaining it, rather than resolving such clashes. And so if I were to articulate a few principles in the 10 minutes I have, I would begin by stressing that the future of global leadership has to itself be global. That may seem obvious enough coming from a former United Nations official like myself, and also for all of us in an international seminar that embraces, in this very panel, people from Hawaii to Paris and here in Kerala. But the fact is that there is no question that it's true for everyone on this planet, because we are living in a much more, in a world that's been brought together much more, and at the same time torn apart much more. The forces of both convergence and disruption are working, convergence and divergence, if you like, are working in our lives. And if you look at these negative forces that we see around us, which have spread violence around the world, acts of terrorism, the unmitigated spread of climate change, the cultural and economic backlash against neoliberalism, the liberal world order, the assertion of cultural authenticity by populist leaders, increasing civil and political strife, a burgeoning refugee crisis, not to mention a host of divisive developments from Trump to Brexit. All of these are factors that are pulling us away from each other. So I think we have to both accept the reality of an increasingly interconnected world, connected as we all are today by the internet and by forces that have brought us in a common cause from around the planet. And at the same time, the need for leaders in the 21st century who can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet and anything they do. But also we need leaders who are capable of operating in a world of contradictory forces. I often think back to 9/11. I was in New York when that happened, because it made clear the old cliche about our global village, because it demonstrated that a fire that started in a remote, dusty cave in one rather obscure corner of the global village could melt the steel girders of the tallest skyscrapers at the other end of the global village. If violence, in other words, can be global, so must our response be. And if we acknowledge, and I think Maya was making this point at the local community level as well, but if we realize even at the global level that we are all interconnected, as somebody once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. And that means we can simply no longer afford to be indifferent about our neighbors, however distant these neighbors may appear. Ignorance is not a shield, it's not even any longer an excuse. So what does that mean for leadership? Well, one very obvious point is that leadership in a time like this around the world should be anchored in empathy. And that is that if there is discontent, we have to empathize. It's a responsibility of leaders to understand what provokes it, to bring and to find long-term answers that benefit as many people as possible. For instance, if you look at the global development agenda, we must move beyond narrow concerns of national security, freedom from terror and attack, to a broader vision of human security, freedom from hunger and hopelessness. And in heading towards that kind of world, it's very clear that if you want a world in which everyone has food, clothing, and shelter, where democracy and human rights reign and are respected and upheld, where people's creative and entrepreneurial energies are freed, and where the environment is protected, then leaders have to join hands with leaders in parliaments, in civil society, in community organizations, in education, and more. Mahatma Gandhi so memorably said, "You must be the change you wish to see in the world." And this means indeed training leaders to be the change that they wish to see. And surely no one wants to see a violent, divided world. The next step clearly is to welcome and embrace diversity. In our world, where we are constantly being reminded, and indeed connections like this are also reminders of what pulls us together as much as the extraordinary diversity we are bringing together, leadership that emphasizes division and difference, communal, religious, caste identities, rather than seeking unity, is always inferior to leadership that seeks common ground and serves to unite people. I'm not saying this only with reference to America, but a true leader builds bridges, not walls. And I think there's no doubt that if you look, for example, in the Indian context, at what we are seeing, for example, in India, I'm very much reminded of the sage lesson of Swami Vivekananda, who taught us that in India, we have to look beyond toleration or tolerance to actually acceptance. Tolerance sounds like a wonderful thing. In many ways, it is hailed as a virtuous act. A tolerant king is a good king because he indulges those who believe things differently from him and so on. But in fact, tolerance is a very patronizing idea, because the tolerant person says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas what Swami Vivekananda preached was not just tolerance, but acceptance. And acceptance says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, please respect my truth and I will respect your truth. That basis for mutual respect is the only thing that guarantees harmonious coexistence. Now here in India, we've been seeing something which is also visible in other parts of the world, a tension between two very different types of leadership on offer. I think it's no secret that our current political leadership, the Prime Minister, the government, believes in the leadership of the hero on the white stallion with the upraised sword, who says he understands all the problems, knows all the answers, and will cut through every Gordian knot in the country with his upraised sword as he charges down to deal with them. And we all know how badly that's worked out so far in India in the last 6 years. And the other kind of leadership that's being talked about is a collective consultative leadership based on building consensus, which would leverage the experience, background, and interests of very different people in an effort to arrive at a mutually acceptable set of solutions. Now, that kind of leadership does risk tipping over into weakness or indecisiveness. And I think it's, since we have a Frenchman on the panel in Bernard, I'm reminded of the story of Alexandre Auguste Ledru-Rollin, who was a 19th century French politician who was the interior minister in the provisional government of the Revolution of 1848, who looked out of his window during the tumultuous events of that time and saw a mob rushing past on the street and promptly headed for the door saying, "Je suis leur chef, il fallait bien les suivre. I am their leader, I should follow them." That's the kind of leadership that I think in many ways is not to be supported, because obviously the fact that this is the only remark for which Monsieur Ledru-Rollin is remembered suggests it's not the most effective or most enduring kind of leadership, because by and large a leader is expected to lead, even if from time to time a good leader also knows how to be a good follower. We have seen how violence can be used to delegitimize a good cause. For example, during the Black Lives Matter protests, the looting of storefronts in so many streets, that dominated the coverage. All of us, even sitting in India, got WhatsApp videos of what was being sent around. And I have to say that, that it's very clear that unless we have leaders who can rise above the limitations of some of their followers, that the use of violence can actually delegitimize a much larger and more worthwhile cause. And so it becomes very important that leadership is able to control, to manage both strengths and weaknesses, and to therefore be transformational. And that calls for collaborative leadership. We see this in organizations, NGOs, in sports teams, in various ways of doing things, but it's very much the way in which we have to head. We all know that every style of leadership is unique in its own way. It'll be pointless to try and say one kind is better than another. Each one is relevant in different situations. But what's striking in the 21st century is the increasing realization that not everyone wants to be a leader. A few years ago, the Girl Scouts of America released the results of the largest ever nationwide survey of young people in America on leadership. There were over 4,000 children surveyed aged 8 to 17. And it showed how the next generation of American adults is thinking about leadership, at least in the context of that country at this time. And what's striking is there was good news and bad news. The good news is that about 4/5 of those surveyed of both sexes said that women and men are equally qualified to lead, which we all know, which is good, and that's welcome. The bad news, however, is that the survey confirmed that a majority of the children and youth surveyed in the US had little or no interest in attaining leadership roles when they become adults. They were asked to rank a number of things, and being a leader came well at the bottom of the list behind other goals such as fitting in, making a lot of money, and helping animals or helping the environment. Now, of course, those are all good things, and I don't know about making money unless you put it to good use, but the fact that people want to do more is certainly laudable. But it's important for leaders to realize that our priorities are not necessarily the priorities of those we seek to lead or even to represent. To want to be a leader is to want to be an exception. And yet the most important word in leadership today is not me, but us. And that becomes increasingly important. I must say that it's striking that in that survey, the young people who were polled on leadership didn't define leaders so much as decisive authority figures, but rather as people who prize collaboration, people who stood up for certain beliefs and values, such as nonviolence, people who are trying to improve society, like Maya was. I'm sure this won't surprise many of you listening today, but what may surprise you is that this definition of leadership that I described mischievously as a 21st century definition actually goes back to the 6th century BC, when the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu wrote these words, and I quote from a translation: "Of the best rulers," in those days, of course, there were kings rather than leaders, so "of the best rulers, the people only know that they exist. The next best they love and praise, the next they fear, and the next they revile. But of the best, when their task is accomplished, their work done, the people all remark, we have done it ourselves." Now that's the best kind of leadership. It's cooperative leadership. It's leadership that makes the followers, or the ones being led, stakeholders in the leader's success. And it's leadership that ensures that that ensuring the objectives is far more important than getting credit for fulfilling them, and that the most effective results are those of which the beneficiaries take leadership. I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes, but I have one more thought. I've had the privilege working in the UN as a young man, working for refugees, running the UN's program for Vietnamese boat people rescued at sea and brought into the port of Singapore at the peak of the Vietnamese boat people crisis. And I learned early what a great privilege it was to be able to put one's head to the pillow at night, knowing the things I'd done during the day had made a real difference to real people's lives. And these are people I could meet and talk to and help and see their lives being transformed. And I genuinely believe that every human being can enjoy the same privilege, whatever precise leadership role they can take on. I want to commend Jai Jagat for what it's doing in actually getting people focused on not just leadership, but on non-violent leadership. I think it's extremely important that we understand how, when we talk about violence, we're actually talking about things that damage human beings and human society, and that if we're talking about non-violent leadership, we're talking about leadership that elevates, that transforms, and that helps. I see that a lot of questions coming in I haven't been able to look at. My 10 minutes are up, and I will not be able to stay a heck of a lot longer, but I will stay longer than planned so I can listen to Bernard and Rajagopalji and see. At some point, though, I will have to leave you all. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful webinar today.
Thank you so much, Shashiji, for this wonderful intervention. What I wanted to highlight was how you talked about the difficulties of singular leaders, the need for collaborative leadership, not cautioning, not mob leadership, but collaborative and cooperative leadership. What I hope we can get you to reflect on possibly at the end, Shashiji, as well as Mayaji, is how do we really see a transformative or transformational leadership at this point in time. I'll turn now to Bernard Dreano and request him to speak. Bernard.
Thank you, and I'm very honored to be invited to this webinar. Well, I want to speak first of all to tell a story. I mean, it's a long story, but it's a story of an experiences we had in the last decades, and starting with the 40 years ago. 40 years ago, we were still in the time of the Cold War and the fear of a Third World War. And at that time, there was also a very, very huge arms race between the two blocs, Soviet Union and the Western world. And a crisis called the Euro missiles crisis happened in Europe because of new weapons being deployed there. And there was a huge peace movement that developed, especially in Western Europe, but also, and that's not very well known in Western Europe. And at that time, I say we because I was part of this movement for disarmament and for peace and for the end of the conflict situation between the two blocs. We created a sort of networks of movements all through Europe and even more. Following an appeal called the Russell Appeal, in the name of Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, also END Appeal, European Nuclear Disarmament Appeal, where we had developed two principles, how to act for peace and disarmament in Europe at that time. The first principle was we members of this movement, we must learn to be loyal not to the East or to the West, but to each other. And we must resist any attempt by the statesmen of East and West to manipulate the movement. So we make a sort of common loyalty from both sides of the divided Europe at that time. We are loyal to each other, working with each other to promote peace and disarmament. And that's became practical actions. That was called detente from below. I mean, there was detente between East and West through social movement. To give you ideas, was participating to such movement. For example, the very important peace movement in the Netherlands called IKV, Interchurch Peace Council, the Germans movement, French movement, the British movement, because the END was launched in UK, but also people like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia at that time, Hungarian movement, Polish movements, etc. Well, at the end, we know that there was the end of the Cold War. Arms race was not stopped, but was less important. And we enter in a period which was supposed to be a period of peace and not with the fear of big wars and so on. Then at that time, we was confronted to a new kind of violent conflict and wars. What was described a bit later by Marie Kaldor in an essay about the new war, old and new war in global era, what we can call war of dislocation, which happens in, for example, for what was still the Yugoslavian Federation, and became, of course, different states. And we was confronted also to how to face such wars. Even some of these people had been involved in this European peace movement. There were some people in several parts of Yugoslavia, and we had to face so this new kind of war. And it's not very well known at all that there was some try to resist to this logic of war. For example, when it started to have this violent conflict in different parts of former Yugoslavia, and there was some reactions. I mean, not to say it's not going. We have to stop the violent conflict, and for example, we developed. I mean, there was a development of action to prevent war, like a peace caravan. We went on from the different capital of the different republic of former Yugoslavia and joined to Sarajevo to say, okay, we must stop this logic of violence and dislocation that's going on, and we must prevent this logic of war was going on, and there was a creation of this was a very huge nonviolent action. I mean, there's including thousands of people, and we had really the idea that it was going to stop the violence which was coming in the, and it was supported also by external people and created we should resist to violence to solve political questions in the specific case of former Yugoslavia, and also to stop the logic of ongoing warfare as a resolution of conflict. I mean, at that time there was also the idea, big actions, symbolic action even, to stop the violence and to stop the ongoing wars can be extremely useful in different regions when such extreme violence started, and also have to have support from outside. We had already built a network during the European level, and also experience of peace activism and lowering of tension, peace marches in different zones, and we were. That makes possible also to have means and solidarity and to support those who were making such action in specific countries and towards specific questions. Nevertheless, if we take the example of former Yugoslavia, we failed. I mean, not only there was a division of former Yugoslavia in several states, but also there was a system of war which developed, and the warmongers were the profiteers and the victors of this situation in the different countries. I mean, those who had been in favor of violence to solve power politics and so on, those who were supposed to help to pacify, I mean, external power, European Union at that time, etc., was not able to do anything. what they did was more developing wars and solving it, despite our efforts to stop that. And the post-war period was in this region, I mean, in the former Yugoslavia, Western Balkan, was not a peace period. It's still not a peace period. It's a post-war period. The same thing happened in other places and other countries, in a general situation where in specific places, because there is a long-time crisis there, because there are some fractures there, things developed into wars. In other places, it's only social unrest or very strong social unrest. So the difference between war and peace being not so strong. I mean, there are some intermediate period where you are just between war and peace, but you're not in the so-called normal peaceful situation, but you're not in the absolutely official war. So there is some degrees. Just to give you an example, in 2005, we had the big riots in France. Well, France was not at all at war, not at all. But from outside, we could have the impression it was a sort of a more civil war. It was a bit like unrest in other countries, like United States. Nevertheless, the legal and practical reaction by the states was using some of the tools that you use usually in wars. And then if you go from a country like France to a place like the Balkans or like South Caucasus, where I was active, you see that not so far you can have the same situation becoming a war. And how you prevent that? We tried, as I said, to do that in former Yugoslavia. We also tried to do that in South Caucasus. Just to give you an example, in the middle of the wars, not before the war, but when the war was already there, we were able to make the trip between the two capitals at war, Baku and Yerevan, with a bus, and to make a local ceasefire, to make the bus pass, and a symbolic action that showed that it was possible to get out of the war. That was possible because there was also international solidarity and building up networks and so on. But basically, we didn't succeed to stop the war where there was the wars, or to solve the social question that was becoming more and more violent in countries like Western European countries. But we were able, and that's very important for the future, to build new practice and new networks. If we come to the beginning of the 21st century, we could see that we had a lot of experience in several countries, in former Yugoslavia, of course, but also elsewhere, with new generation built up on non-violence principle, even if the non-violence was not always put in front as such. It's dependent of the countries, and developing some new practice. I just want to give you two examples. One example is the Turkish-Armenian Dialogue, which was quite developed in the beginning of the 21st century. It even had a name. It was called Yavats Kamats, which means slowly, slowly, in the two languages, Armenian and Turks. And it was 90% young people. The same thing in former Yugoslavia, where it were new, just after the war, new movement emerging, social movements, I mean, including some quite traditional, like workers' movement, but also, I would say, cultural movements and new NGOs, like, for example, the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, existing both in Belgrade and in Sarajevo, or the Nonviolent movement was created both in Belgrade and Sarajevo by former fighters in the civil war just before. So this was this kind of experiment, and we could see that to a much broader size when there was the Arab Spring. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, I was myself in Tunis, and I could see that. Of course, there was there were no theory about it, but practically, one of the slogans of the demonstrators was Sulamaya, which means pacifism, peace. The willingness to be non-military, to demilitarize the intifada, as one of my Palestinian friends said. That was the an emerging new culture. And the small experience we had in the Balkans shows that that was possible because there was an education of a new, I won't say leaders, but I'd say at least activists of the new movements. Unfortunately, of course, these movements were confronted to very strong backlash and repression. Well, sometimes real repression, sometimes if you take Western countries, for example, it's not strong repression, but it's a kind of media and mainstream coverage just makes things invisible. And also, and that's a very big question we have to ask to ourselves, the incapacity of these movements, even if they were very strong, to develop a sort of political visibility. It was leaderless movement, as we already said, and which doesn't mean there are not real leaders inside, but with no incarnation and no effect on the political, or not big effect on the political screen. That's true in the Balkans, that's true in South Caucasus, but that's true also in countries like our European countries. It's less complicated, but nevertheless, it's the same phenomenon. But at the same time, we can see that these movements, also they are quite invisible, are really rooted because they re-emerge frequently. For example, now you have a third generation of peace activists in the Balkans. The third generation. The first one was those who resist to the war when the war started in former Yugoslavia. The second one was those who emerged just after the war. I'm sorry because I have a dog who disagree with me. And the last one was is just now emerging. That's people who are 20 years old. Another symbol of that is I spoke about the Arab Spring in 2011. It was blocked by repression, but it starts again. And we see, for example, this enormous movement in Algeria or in Sudan. In Algeria, it's very interesting because it is absolutely explicitly non-violent. The movement called Iraq, explicitly. At the same time, there are not at all any theory about it. I mean, if you go to Egypt, or if you go to Lebanon, you will see people who are quoting Gandhi and things like that. Not at all in Algeria, but de facto, they adopt a non-violent strategy and a long-term strategy. I'm sorry because I have to stop this dog. I don't know why he disagrees. So just to sum up what I'm meaning, in these last decades, we have been in several parts of the world create some kind of new culture, new political culture. I mean, news, of course, had some roots in the past, but it's new political culture that we can call non-violent, even in some places the people would not like to be called non-violent, but they are. What they do is non-violent. We had the occasion to experience that when we planned to cross the Balkans with the Rajagopal march. I mean, some local people in Serbia, for example, say, don't speak about non-violence. But then when we spoke practically, they say they were non-violent. So we have this developing culture. It's also a matter of education and of activism for long-range activism. It's a long road. It's not something that's going to be short. There is this big question of how to solve the political gap, because we have some influence in the society, but not so much on the leadership. But at the same time, not so much, but still there. I mean, it's depend of the different countries, it's depend of the different places, but nevertheless, I just want to finish to give you a few examples. First of all, this solidarity movement that developed during the pandemic, COVID-19. We are trying to have figures about what has been done, but in the country that I am following, I can tell you that everywhere there have been some actions to support local people, and especially the marginalized people and that's true also, for example, in the Western Balkans, but also, of course, also in countries like Brazil or elsewhere. And the second thing is the movement against racism and discrimination. In France, we have a very, very strong movement that just suddenly blossomed. Nobody was expecting it. There was a forbidden demonstration at the end of the confinement, at the end of the, when all demonstration was, of course, forbidden. And about something like, after, of course, what happened in the United States, and 40,000 participants participated in a very, very peaceful manner. That puzzled the police. I mean, nobody was expecting that. 90% of these demonstrators being less than 25 years old. That's very interesting. And other examples, of course, are well known about the environmental movement. And there is a sort of a beginning of convergence between these movements around these ideas of non-militaristic, and when I say militaristic, I not only speak of weapons, but of the way you organize. Non-militaristic activities, non-violent de facto, as I said, even if you don't avoid resistance, and strong cooperation or connection. These are interconnected movements. So I am relatively optimistic for the future. We still have this big question. We are developing a lot of brilliant local young leaders for this movement, but we are not able to answer at the level of the political field. I don't know if it's tragic or if it's just a fact, but that's the situation today. And we have to communicate and to speak to each other about those questions. But I'm quite proud to have been participating to such movement in the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, because when I saw some of these people who have just educated during these years, I mean, people from Jagat met some of them in Armenia. Well, we have done quite good work, I would say. So that's all for now.
Thank you, Bernard. When we look back at the siege of Sarajevo and see how that affected peace in Europe and how you described it, and the effect of the leaderless movements in Georgia and the Balkans, we take your point very seriously. We need to support this new political culture, these young people who are
We don't hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. You hear me now? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Not very good.
Can you hear? Yeah. So thank you very much, Bernard. And now I'm going to turn the discussion over to Rajagopal. Can you hear me through this mic, Bernard? Is
Yes,
it difficult to hear?
It's not, I can hear you, but it's not very good.
It's not good. Okay, we're just going to switch to the telephone. Discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I am very happy to be part of this forum. And after this great presentation by Maya, Shashi, Tharoor and Bernard, it is interesting to join this discussion. Now we are discussing about leadership and also non-violent leadership. So we are not just discussing leadership, but also about non-violent leadership. And that means a leadership that has the capacity to look at things through a non-violent lens. You know, whatever I do, whatever action I take, if I have the capacity to look through a non-violent lens, then I can understand, look, many of my actions, whether it is going to create violence or it is going to create harmony in the society. So from that perspective, this is a very, very important discussion. So one area that we need to understand is the limitations of the present day model. Look at the economic leadership of the world. And this is completely exposed after COVID-19, that 1% of people accumulating 50% of global wealth. This is what is going to happen. Millions of people on the road walking back home without job, so much of poverty and misery. So the economic leadership of the world have completely failed in terms of establishing an economy the real meaning of politics is art of organizing the society. And the political leadership of the world have done everything else other than organizing the society. So this is a very, very difficult time where political leadership has taken us to a very difficult period of time in this world. I will also refer to the scientific leadership. You know, the leadership in the scientific field, they must have sent people to moon, they must have sent people to the orbit to bring a handful of soil. But in terms of dealing with poverty and misery of millions of people, they are their brothers and sisters on the land, on the earth. We have failed. And also the religious leadership. The religious leadership was supposed to take us from rituals to spirituality. And we have come to a situation where we are still fighting in the name of rituals, in the name of religion. So one area is to understand how did we fail, in spite of all the education, in spite of all our understanding, why did we fail in terms of having enlightened leadership in the field of economy, in the field of science, in the field of politics, and also in the field of religion. So that brings us to this position where we need to discuss this issue of non-violent leadership. It is not good enough to fight these forces, fight this leadership as they are there today, but to think about what needs to be done in order to develop new kind of leadership. How do we do that? And I always feel that this is where Gandhi is giving some answer. See, Gandhi, through his speeches and also life, has shown that leadership can be very, very different. Like service to the society need not lead to getting to power. All the services that we need to do to the society need not take us to power. So service without an expectation to get to power. And his idea of thinking about the weakest and poorest in the society. Why can't the leadership of the world focus on the poorest and weakest? And Gandhi's tennis plan is an interesting direction for us to follow. And his idea of not to compromise with injustice, rather than perpetuating injustice, not to compromise with injustice. So the new kind of leadership will have to take this position that we will not compromise with injustice, and we will always think about the weak and poor. And he's also bringing all the religions together. Now, if Gandhi can do that, others should also be able to do that. Turkish-Armenian, one of his followers says, he never knew that prayer can be such a radical instrument to bring people together. So even prayer, Gandhiji used it in order to bring people together, not to divide people in the name of religion. And a lifestyle that is not accumulating wealth, but more simple and simplicity. And ultimately promoting truth and non-violence through life examples so that you can stand up and say, look, my life is my message. And Gandhi wanted such leaders not only at the national level and global level, but he wanted such leadership at the grassroots level. This is what is missing today. We may think about leaders in Delhi, we may think about leaders in New York and Washington, but we need to think about leaders at the grassroots level. When Gandhi says self-sufficient, self-governed villages uniting into a nation called India, this is what he meant. And every country should listen to this, that if people are self-sufficient, self-governed at the bottom level, and they unite at the national level, then you don't need a lot of leadership at the top. People will manage their life on their own rather than creating so much misery and poverty. So, Jai Jagat wanted to identify such leadership all over the world, and then we were able to identify some of them, and we want to bring them together. Now, let me give you some of this example. Like Restart is an organization in Armenia, and when some people wanted to use violence, like the example that Shashi was giving in America, when the followers want to have violence, but then in Armenia, when followers wanted to have violence, these people were able to control them, and as a result, they were able to bring about a non-violent revolution in 2018, and they are proud about it. We find young people in Iran, like Poyon, who are organizing non-violent tourism. They want young people to visit all these tourist places to imbibe the spirit of non-violence and see how religion and history can be learned from a non-violent perspective. And urban process in Bhopal by people like enrich is a very, very interesting thing, because they are taking young people to expose them to reality at the grassroots level so that they come back sensitized. And Swaraj University in Rajasthan is a great example where young people are not asking for degree, but they are asking for experiences that will sensitize them to really do good work in the society. And the Blue Ribbon work in Bombay is very, very interesting. Many young people getting involved in social service with an understanding of non-violence. We have CSRC in Nepal promoting a lot of non-violent training program. In Mexico, we have this Aura Mandala by Sonia and group. So many young people are getting interested in a non-violent model of leadership. I can also speak about Reva Joshi in Canada through the Gandhi Foundation, Canadian Gandhi Foundation. Not only young people outside, but also in the school system, how they go into classrooms and help young people to understand how to resolve their issues through negotiations and dialogue is a very interesting example. And in Brazil, we have our great activist school where young people are trained, especially in the streets when there are troubles and violence, how to deal with it. The Quakers are a great example where they have done very interesting work, not only in Europe, but also in Africa and in Asian countries to promote nonviolent leadership, and their presence in South Asia helped us in a big way to promote nonviolent leadership. What Subramji does in India through the community prayer and work camps is very interesting. It is called National Youth Project. Thousands of young people who understand the spirit of all religions coming together, praying together, and practicing it together. It's a very interesting example. And finally, the School of Wellbeing in Thailand, run by Sulak Shivaraksha. So what I'm trying to say, and there are many more, I can have a longer list, but what I'm trying to argue or submit today is that there are so many interesting processes happening, And Jagat can become a platform for all these initiatives to come together. And I was listening to Maya today, how what a beautiful work that she is involved in. So if we can bring all this process together and understand that the leadership in the economic field, in the scientific field, in the political field, in the religious field, have somehow failed to become enlightened, to reach at a level where the world can be a peaceful place, a place where we can all live in harmony, people and nature. But rather than attacking that and criticizing that all the time, probably we create a new process by which we will be able to achieve a greater peace and harmony between people, between nature. And that is what Jagat would like to achieve. And we want the support of everyone in this process. So thank you very much for today's forum.
I'm going to suggest Shashi ji and Maya and Bernard and Rajagopal, if we could just have a few of the questions that have come up before we conclude the session. So again with Maya, I think what has come up on the chat is, could you describe some of the peace leadership strategies that you have been practicing, maybe a couple of examples? And a second question is, what role does the spiritual play in peace education work? Maya, can you respond to that before we ask Shashi one or two questions?
Absolutely. I will endeavor to do so fairly quickly, but definitely my feeling is that in all of the sort of abstractions that we've looked at and explored to date, there are certain strategies that can be implemented as part of peace education and everybody's education. One is that education needs to be connected, not disconnected or disembodied from story, culture, and community. So building bridges between school, family, and community is essential. So one of my nonprofits, Seeds of Peace with a C, in fact does that and does action plan development using backwards mapping. You begin with envisioning the harvest, and then you think about, which, how to prepare the soil, and then, how to get buy-in and participation, and how to nurture to sustain, and specific tools might include perhaps seeing things from multiple perspectives. An activity called Media Matters. Media Matters is where you take a 10 newspaper view of a single day or event, and you look at the differences between them. What is emphasized, what is de-emphasized, what is on page 1 versus page 13. Can you read between the lines, that careful listening for what is not said and what that means? And in the aggregate, all of those 10 newspapers from different countries all over the world present a fuller reality. We do something called Pick a Picture, Build a Life, where you take a newspaper picture and you build a life and information and do research about that person, or you rewrite a story from the perspective of other far away, perhaps, and preferably someone with whom you are in a conflict situation. There are structured academic controversies, which are ways to not do debates, but in fact to argue one side and then to explore the opposite side through writing journal poetry, pulpit speech, and other creative means, and then you braid the two sides, find the points of intersection between the two sides, or develop your own positioning that takes from multiple perspectives. These activities should be undertaken with children, but also I believe that there needs to be some effort to engage in sustained dialogue that does require switching perspectives and braiding perspectives with adults and with people in leadership positions. And we do need to think of breaking down the four walls, which has been amply done at this time, and making sure that there is learning that is happening in the farms and in the fish ponds in the community, and in places of not just entrepreneurship, but also, deep public opportunities for deep public participation. And I think that so much of this is part and parcel of what is valuable in interfaith leadership. And my hope is that we realize that since the vast majority of the world is comprised of the faithful, when we as leaders think of faith engagement as being an essential part of peace building, I think that we have a lot of and see a lot of productive and passionate participation. There's so many ways in which the various faiths are aligned, but so many of the leaders fail to say to their flocks that building peace is the way that you serve your God or gods. And so just to very briefly mention that, my hope is that when we think about speaking from the perspective of our various faiths, that when challenged and afforded the opportunity to lean into our discomfort, we can in fact become deeper practitioners of a particular faith. Being challenged enables us or forces us, compels us to really think about what is meaningful. So that's not something that breaks apart faith to be in dialogue with other faiths, in other words, is an opportunity to express one's faith, in my estimation, with greater meaning and purpose and commitment. And I want to make sure other people have a chance to talk. I could keep going on, but I'll also send to all of you a whole series of resources, digital resources that don't necessarily address the digital divide, but also peace building resources that are free and accessible to all, as well as classes in negotiation, mediation, facilitation, restorative justice that all of the participants can perhaps utilize with not just youth, but whatever spaces in which you work and live.
Thank you very much, Maya. That was amazing. I think we need a whole webinar on looking at peace leadership strategies. Very, very rich. We will parse that up and try to put that into a list that people can use, a menu. Shashi, I was wondering if, there's many questions to you, but we don't have time. One that I found interesting was how, in this very fast pace of life, do you build cooperative leadership? Because it takes time. It's a time-taking process. And we're in an urgent and critical situation. I was wondering if you could just respond to that question.
Sure, Jill, and my apologies. I will have to leave immediately after because I'm already late for my next event. But it's been fascinating listening to all the panelists, and I thank you for including me in this, this really fascinating exercise. Now, the question of how to build any kind of leadership is not easily answered, because I think we've heard from people who are in the business, particularly Maya and Rajagopal, who've done some of this. Bernard's references to former Yugoslavia were very striking, because I was at the receiving end for 7 years. I was the person at the United Nations peacekeeping department handling the civil war in the former Yugoslavia under Kofi Annan. And so I lived through a lot of this. So the how part is tough. The only answer that I can offer is that it's our responsibility to show people that, in fact, they would actually find collaborative leadership more effective in delivering results than top-down leadership. Because ultimately, unless every individual you are trying to lead is made to feel a stakeholder and is made to feel that they themselves will gain from your leadership, you are really not going to be able to keep them with you for an indefinite period of time. Now, I know that politically there are various riposts that people can come up with. Look at Putin's leadership, or Xi Jinping's, or even Narendra Modi in India, who are very much a top-down style. I think that the verdict is out about how effective they are in terms of having improved the life possibilities of their populations. Ultimately, in smaller units, whether it's NGO units, community building efforts, and so on, there is no substitute for collaborative leadership. Yes, there's a questioner points out it takes time, but frankly, so does everything. Results always take time. You can't rush results. Right now, we are in a world in which indeed we live by the 24/7 news cycle, where actions and results are judged in an impossibly short time frame. But the meaningful results are the ones that are built up towards. And I think ultimately people realize it's in their interest to work towards an incremental result. You will be able to promote collaborative leadership. I'm sorry if that sounds vague. One has to look at concrete examples. We've got people here on the panel who've worked directly on such examples and can tell us about their concrete results. In the world in which I'm now engaged, which is that of contemporary Indian politics, or my previous experience at the United Nations, I would say that we have perhaps a little more time to play with when it comes to building up effective results. Politicians measure results by election results. So your time frame is the next election. Often it isn't long enough to achieve anything really worthwhile, but at least you have until the next election to bring about a result. At the global stage, of course, you have the next moment of accountability. But in many ways, that moment of accountability, whether it's to a governing body, a Security Council, a General Assembly, a Parliament, a board of directors in your organization, that moment of accountability gives you the real deadline to address this question of time and shortness of time. I'm going to have to leave you there. Thank you so much for including me. And
thank you, Shashi.
All the very best to the other panelists in their noble work.
And we'll
thank you, Maya, Bernard, Rajagopal, all the best. Good to talk to you all. Good to meet you. And Jai Jagat indeed. Wish you all success for the rest of the webinar.
Jai Jagat. Jai Jagat. Bernard, we found a question that was very relevant to what you said, which is, if leadership actually comes out of violence, often non-violent leadership emerges out of violent situations, as you mentioned the siege of Sarajevo as an example, how do you really sustain non-violent leadership? How can you transform it, and how do you therefore sustain? I'm afraid we only have a couple of minutes, but if you could just give us one or two pointers in that.
Of course, very visible leadership comes in time of crisis, not only, not always of very violent, but it's in time of crisis that you see, that you objectively see the leaders, that they are visible. In terms of quiet situation, I would say, or more peaceful situation or routine situation, even if it can be violent, you don't see so much where the leaders are, even if they are there. I mean, there is a difference between visible leaders and rooted leaders. Sometimes they are the same, but they appear at some moment. But it's not directly connected with violence. And some of the leaders can be visible precisely because they oppose violence, or because they oppose the trend of the dislocation that's going on. I could give an example of that. Even if we have now this very specific, because of the technology also, the very specific leaderless movement where you have no incarnation of a leader, of a spokesperson, or so on. which is a relatively new phenomenon to that extent. I mean, it always exists, but not at such extent. So we have to make the difference between this media, visibly mediatic leaders and the real rooted leaders. I could give example of, for example, to take the example of Yugoslav wars, there were some possible leaders fighting violence in a situation of violence. I mean, the war was going on. Some of the people I'm going to speak about was sometimes forced to have to resist to the situation, but they were definitely trying to get out of the spiral of violence. I could say, for example, the mayor of Tuzla, Selim Beslacic, but he had no audience at the international level. He was not part of the negotiation. I could also quote the Serbian leader, Zoran Djindjic, but he was assassinated, not by chance. I mean, first, of course, it was by the local mafia, and others. And in the long term, you can have figures which are not so mediatic, but prove to be stronghold, I mean, for the long-term activities. To face a crisis, you don't need only leaders, you need movement. You need, and as Shashi quoted this Lao Tse quote, I mean, the good leader is the leader that you don't see. You have just the impression you do it yourself, but you need, at one moment, you needed some kind of people crystallizing your common will. That's what
Bernard, I'm going to have to thank you at this point because we're a little over time and we have another program, but we just are so delighted that you, Maya and Shashiji, were able to give us a framing on this morning's discussion. And we hope that you will stand by and see some of the rest of the speakers. And let us keep in touch in building more movement